Good afternoon, everybody. As always, my name is JC, and welcome to my channel, Every Man's Thoughts. Spoiler alert, today I break down Season 1, Episode 7 of Rings of Power, so with that, you've been warned, so let's get started. We start Episode 7 where we left off in Episode 6. Galadriel is waking up amidst the town being buried in volcanic ash from the explosion of what is now Mount Doom. From the last few minutes of Episode 6 through the first few of Episode 7, Galadriel has transformed from a person in utter disbelief to a state of shock. She's clearly out of sorts and having a difficult time processing exactly what has happened. As Galadriel continues to struggle with her stupor, we begin to see the scale of the calamity that has befallen these people. Their village and surrounding lands have been completely destroyed, and even under the best of circumstances would likely remain uninhabitable beyond the remainder of their lives. As the scene continues, they are effectively reduced to search and rescue as they try and salvage what they can before they are inevitably forced to flee the area. If you were paying close attention during the rescue scene, we saw two noteworthy events. First, the Queen was hit in the face with a blast of sparks and presumably an accompanying wave of superheated air. More on that later. Second, the inn collapses, apparently killing Isildur. More on that later as well. Anyway, as we continue with the story, the villagers and army begin to leave the village and head towards the Númenórean encampment. On the trail, we're treated to a little more exposition, moving the story forward, and the dialogue begins to take center stage, and that's not a good thing. The writers insisted on force-feeding us the blatantly obvious when Galadriel had to explain to Theo why it was the orcs ignited the volcano. On the positive side, we are seeing some character growth with Galadriel. Her edges are softening, she's less condescending, and she is apparently coming to terms with who and what she is. I also liked when she handed Theo her sword to give him something else to focus on other than his troubles. This is a character that hasn't had many likable moments, but this was one of them. On the flip side, we learned that the flash of sparks has blinded the Queen, and this was given to us with the high level of cringe that we've come to expect.
How long have we been clear of it?
Nearly a mile.
I see.
Do you?
I will say this though, as I watch through a second time, if you know the Queen has been blinded, you do see telltale signs in earlier scenes. But the circumstances of those scenes may lead you to think you're seeing something else until it's made very obvious to you. As I mentioned in my previous video, I always enjoy this type of setup. This is also when Elendil finds out that his son Isildur has apparently died in the fire. Much like Galadriel, we begin to see Elendil reflect upon his life and the choices that he's made. For the remainder of the episode, he has nothing but contempt for Galadriel and the idea of conquering these lands.
I should never have pulled the elf on board. I should have left her in the sea where I found her.
It will be interesting to see moving forward if his entire belief system has changed and he holds the same disdain for all elves, or if his contempt is just reserved for Galadriel. A couple of side notes I forgot to mention. When Galadriel is on the road with Theo, she mentions her husband Celeborn went off to war and never came back. This gives the writers a workaround as to why he's not in the show, but he does show up later in the Peter Jackson trilogies. Also, we all know that Isildur isn't actually dead. He's such a well-established character with an important role to play that it makes you wonder why they would even try and build suspense around his supposed early demise. However, when Isildur's horse refuses to go with Elendil and runs back towards the village, it all but confirms that Isildur is still alive, and likely sets up yet another scene that they rip off from Peter Jackson when Isildur's horse rescues him in much the same way that Aragorn's horse did in the trilogy films. Before I continue with the other storylines, I want to review this one and talk about why this show is so frustrating and ultimately mired in mediocrity. We start with these beautiful visuals and set design along with an excellent audio accompaniment. I've said it before, but Taken as a whole, this is the most visually impressive television show I've ever seen, and I'm hoping come award season the people responsible receive the proper acknowledgement. Despite how beautiful everything looks, as usual, it's the story delivery that lets the viewer down. For instance, the pacing of the episode. If you factor out the opening credits, we were on this opening scene for slightly more than 4 minutes. All of this destruction and visual presentation for us to take in, and we get this for 4 minutes before we immediately transition to the hobbits. Then we get the hobbits for 4 minutes before we transition to the dwarves. Then we get the dwarves for a whopping 7 minutes before we bounce back to the Númenóreans and the Southlands. We get to stay for a solid 6 minutes before we're back to the hobbits for another 4 minutes before we move again, and on it goes. This herky-jerky pacing keeps yanking the viewer out of the moment for a show that doesn't have that much interesting content to begin with. This type of story construction prevents the viewer from forming an attachment to the characters and ultimately caring about what's going on. Beyond the pacing, there are issues within the story elements themselves. Scenes that should be high points coming off as cringe or underwhelming, and mediocre writing in general. Given the ongoing issues, I think it's more than fair to acknowledge the extreme inexperience of the lead showrunners and ask whether or not they are even capable of delivering a show to the quality we expect. Anyway, rant over, let's move on to the dwarves. The dwarven storyline opens with Elrond negotiating with King Durin, and the elves offering an outrageous bounty for access to Mithril. Despite the generous offer, the king says no. Because we all know the conclusion of the Moria story, we all understand the wisdom in the king's words. To paraphrase, the king says digging into that rock is too risky and they don't delve into the shadows. This is a direct reference to Saruman's words from the trilogy about the dwarves delving too greedily and too deep and awaking fire and shadow. The king also mentions the fall of the entire kingdom, which, as we know, is exactly what happens. Although Prince Durin is desperate to save his friend and the elven race in general, he begrudgingly goes along with his father's decision, making the argument that the king is to be respected. However, the prince changes his mind when he sees the healing power of the Mithril upon the leaf from the elven tree. Thus, he and Elrond begin prospecting the mine without the king's leave. However, as the mine is unstable, working it causes tremors, which alerts the king to their shenanigans. Unfortunately for Elrond and the prince, the king arrives just as they break through into a massive chasm with more mithril than they ever could have hoped for. This leads to a heated engagement between the king and the prince, resulting in the king renouncing his son's claim to the throne. After the argument, the king orders the mithril mine sealed and casually tosses the elven leaf into the chasm. The leaf falls deep within the chasm and is set aflame immediately upon touching ground, where we get the big reveal of Durin's Bane, the Balrog. The highlight of all of this, of course, is the Balrog, but upon further consideration, I think this might be some deception. Let me explain. First, let's assume that the Balrog being the highlight event of that story is by design, and that's what they want people talking about, and that's why it was released in this episode. However, when I first saw the reveal, I thought it was off, and of course I ascribed this to the usual mediocre writing and this show's uncanny inability to get out of its own way to tell a good story. For me, the scene was overdone and not particularly dramatic. I would have liked to have seen something more subtle, such as maybe the leaf catches fire and we hear a noise, or at most a pair of glowing eyes in the background. I have to ask myself if they went so big and so anticlimactic because they had to make sure that's where your focus was. However, I would call your attention to the scene immediately prior to the big reveal. When Prince Durin is at his lowest for what he perceives as having failed Elrond, Disa steps in. She manipulates him against his father, tells him that the kingdom really belongs to them, that they will rule that kingdom and all other kingdoms, says that the mithril also belongs to them, and no matter what their father says, eventually they will dig. These lines were incredibly self-serving and way over the top beyond your typical supportive wife. It was also well out of line of what we've come to expect with this character, so there are red flags all over the place. Now, I still think Halbrand is going to be Sauron, but we also know the show likes to drop these little hints. Sauron or not, there may be something up with Disa, and moving forward, we should probably watch her with a more keen eye. As I mentioned earlier, there were also 2 conversations between the prince and his father. The first, when the king informed his son he was not going to help the elves. The second, when the king found out his son had betrayed him. Both had noteworthy elements. When the king informs his son he won't be helping the elves, he references the dwarven creation myth. He says that dwarves are made of stone and fire. The stone wants to be permanent, but the fire acknowledges the truth that eventually all things must be consumed. From these teachings is where the king gains his moral compass. He believes in the cycle of life and therefore can justify protecting his own kingdom versus the risk of the extinction of the elves. He even goes so far as to say that he believes the elves are trying to cheat death. The second conversation between the prince and the king wasn't nearly as interesting. After the king finds out about his son's betrayal, the discourse gets a bit heated. Eventually, the prince accuses the king of stifling him and not letting him be his own man. The problem is, as viewers, we have no context for this. In fact, from what we've seen in the series so far, I'd say it was the exact opposite. The net result being that this scene that was intended to be highly emotional falls flat and leaves the viewer wondering what it is they missed. This is a great example of the bad writing and lack of awareness that have plagued this show from the beginning. Unfortunately, it wasn't even the only example in this episode, as you're about to see when we talk about the Hobbits. One final note about the dwarves. At the end of the second conversation, when the argument becomes heated, the king rips off his son's golden collar and throws it to the ground. This collar is actually a badge of office and denotes the prince as the heir to the throne. So when the king tells him to leave it on the floor, it's not his anymore. He's disinheriting his son and removing him from the line of succession. We'll see if he was serious about that or just a little overheated in the moment. And with that, we are now on to the Hobbits. The stranger and friends arrive at the so-called grove well after the rest of the tribe, only to find out that it has been destroyed from some of the volcanic spew from the explosion of Mount Doom. I say so-called because the aerial footage clearly shows that this grove was really only 1, maybe 2 fruit trees, and the destruction of those 2 trees completely wiped out the hobbits. So let me get this straight. The hobbits have a seasonal migration, not annual, not biannual, season. So every couple of months, a seasonal migration where they travel what looks like hundreds of miles through swamps and over hills, manually pulling carts, which would take far longer than the season that they're traveling for lasts, just to get to a grove that has 2 trees. Imagine their disappointment when they found out those trees were destroyed. Sorry, I had to take a moment there. Anyway, you know, the hobbits have been coming to that grove for generations. Did anyone not think to just plant one of the fruit seeds so they could have, you know, a 3rd tree? I mean, if your entire tribe depends on it, that just seems prudent to me. Sorry, I needed another moment there. With the food supply gone and the tribe in trouble, the hobbits ask the stranger if he could use his magic to heal the grove. While the stranger is trying to help the tribe, one of the incessantly annoying hobbit children interrupts and almost loses her life to a large falling branch. Despite the fact that this incident was completely the fault of the child and in full view of everybody, the tribe immediately turns on the man that was trying to help them and gives the stranger the boot. On a side note, when the stranger was healing the tree, Sadok Burrows mentioned that some trees could talk. This was an obvious direct reference to the Ents and the Entwives. The next morning, the hobbits wake up to find the grove has been completely renewed, so they immediately begin to feast and celebrate. Apparently not a shred of guilt for kicking out the stranger who saved their lives twice now. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, we see the mysterious priests who are still on the trail of the stranger. The Harfoots inexplicably decide to inject themselves into the scenario and lie to the priests, which has the immediate result of their camp being destroyed. Some people would call that karma. In all seriousness, though, this iteration of hobbits is supposed to be deathly afraid of strangers, particularly full-size humans. So why is Nori putting her people in danger and alerting the priests to her presence when she can just simply let them pass? Furthermore, she has no reason to assume that these priests have malicious intent towards the stranger, so why is she lying to them in the first place? She knows he's lost, she knows they're looking for him. Most people would come to the exact opposite conclusion. Now, earlier in the video, when talking about the dwarves, I mentioned that the show has been plagued with bad writing and a lack of self-awareness. Well, this brings us to another very similar situation. With their carts destroyed and the tribe demoralized, one of the hobbits gives a speech about how their true strength is how they always stay true to each other and everything will be fine, which immediately rallies the troops. But as the viewer, this is a complete disconnect from reality. In the short time that we've known them, the hobbits have abandoned the stranger despite that he saved their life twice, abandoned injured members of their tribes, presumably to die, and have entire ceremonies to get dedicated to the people they've abandoned in the past. Moreover, some of the tribe members were outright advocating for going beyond abandonment and taking proactive steps to ensure someone's demise, like stealing their cartwheels. Anyway, I'm done with this episode. I can't wait for this season to be over. If you've stayed this long, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and I will see you next time.